Also, hello everyone. Welcome to another session of our seminar series, Topics in Early Modern Studies. It is a pleasure to see you all today. As always, before I introduce today's speaker, I will give you the house rules so we can keep interference to a minimum. Please keep your microphones muted during the entire talk. After the presentation, we will have time for questions. Exceptionally, I would ask you to use only the chat for making your questions today because we're experiencing uncommon connection issues. Questions can be made in English, Portuguese, Spanish, or French, whichever you feel more comfortable with. I would also like to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel later on. Having that said, today, Lívia and I have the pleasure to receive a dear friend of mine, Dr. Marcella Miranda. Marcella is a lecturer on political history of Latin America at the Universidad Carlos III de Madrid and a researcher of the Early Modern Iberian History Study Group of the University of São Paulo. She has studied history at the Federal University of Minas Gerais and received her MA and PhD from the University of São Paulo. She's majorly interested in early modern European political and intellectual history. And in today's seminar, Marcella will present a paper entitled Reason of State in Early Modern Europe Between Theory and Practice, which we are all very excited to hear. Thank you, Marcella, once again for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Veronica. I will put my presentation. The PowerPoint is right. It's okay for everyone, the PowerPoint? Perfect.
Yes.
So, hello, good evening to everyone. First, I would like to thank Veronica and Lívia for the invitation to be part of the seminar. I'm pleased to participate in this activity. Thank you very much, and I really hope you can enjoy my talk. First, I want to apologize because I don't speak English very well. So I will try to, I will read a paper, but I was very concerned to make a presentation that was very easy for the listening, especially in talking about political theory. So my apologies, and I'm sorry for the possible mistakes. So before we start, I really need to say that my paper is a kind of an essay. So I will probably bring up more questions than answers. The main purpose of this conference is to discuss the two phases of the reason of states debates in early modern Europe, both theoretical and practical. First, I will try to summarize the main lines of historiography to point out the limits of some interpretation that didn't consider the historical development of the political language. Then, I will intend to analyze the practical aspects of the language that had something innovative, something traditional. My argument is that many researchers that usually wrote about this debate focused just on the normative side of the discussion. And because of that, they present a limited vision of one of the most vibrant language of politics on early modern Europe. We will also compare the theoretical and practical perspectives to identify connections and detachments. I admit that in this case, my work circumscribes the Spanish monarchy territories, and especially Low Countries in Spain and the Kingdom of Naples. I'm familiar with these territories, and also France and eventually England. England, I studied, especially the Jesuits that escaped to the continent in the 16th century, but I will not bring the discussion here. I just say that I studied, but today I will not talk about that because that's a lot of information. And well, because of this limitation, I do not try to extend my conclusions to other territories outside Western Europe. When we start to research on the history of ideas, it's almost natural to begin with the political theories and historiography. We always try to read the historians, read the theory to get familiar to what people were saying about and what we want to study. The problem is that it can establish a set of preconceptions that put a limit on the discussion and impoverish the debate. It's not coincidence that the two main theories of this school were accused at the time of not being originals. They were Giovanni Botero and Justus Lipsius. And in English, we say Justus Lipsius, no, like in Latin. So I will pronounce like that. I intend to say Justus Lipsius because I study in Spanish, but no, Justus Lipsius. Okay. It's not a worry to highlight that the period between 1580 and 1650 was a time when a wide discussion concerning the conservation and the expansion of the state among the bureaucrats, jurists, arbitraries, political theorists, militaries, and diplomats consolidate in Europe. In parallel, we may also find the debate about the needed virtues of the modern prince. From the core of these reflections emerge the languages of reason of state. There is a large debate on the historiography regarding the rise of reasoned state languages. Yes, as you can see, I prefer to use the term language rather than theory or concept. I will explain the cause along this presentation. First, I would like to highlight the greatest challenge to study the reason of the state in early modern Europe is the linguistical one. As Bartolomé Clabero once stated, it seems to be an expression that is understood by itself since people know separately what is reason from one side and what is state from another side. Another difficulty is that there were plenty of expressions employed to denotate the reason of state. For example, matter of state, that is even more common in the sources, rules of state, tricks of state, not a good one, courtesy of state. This one is more is inspired in Baltasar Castiglione, the courtier, and they say courtesy of state. And they are talking about the dissimulation, the idea of you dissimulate to help the state, to dissimulate to protect the secrets of state. So in Spanish, it's beautiful. They say finetos de Estado. Maravilha. And in another words, another expression like political reason, prudence law. So what I'm trying to say is that not necessarily the talk about reason of state in 16th, 17th century, people will employ this term. So there are a variety of expressions that can be employed to denotate what we call reason of state. And The attempt to recover the basic meaning of the term to compose the language is a possible way to avoid the obstacles that we have previously recognized. The first time that we find the expression reason or state in a work, to the best of my knowledge, is in the dialogue of the government of Florence from Francesco Guicciardini, written between 1521 and 1526. Surprise! It was not Machiavelli who talked about reason state. Machiavelli never used the expression reason state. When Guicciardini expressed the term reason state, he was reflecting on the validity, on the terms in conscience and Christian morality of the wars made by Florence to conquer and dominate Pisa. Killing and arresting the citizens of Pisa was justified by reason and customs of the state, but were not actually legitimate actions by conscience. Hence, the state dominion was founded on violence, while the republic had a legitimate foundation. In the Guicciardini's vision, from the moment that Florence started to sustain an expansionist operation to dominate other cities, the Republic of Florence had become a state of Florence. 60 years later, the term appeared in the title of Giovanni Bottero's work Della Ragion di Stato. Meanwhile, the expression had spread and had been circulating among the corpus of bureaucrats of the monarchies. In 1561, for example, Thomas Perrenot de Chantonnet, ambassador of Philip II in France, warned the king that Catherine of Medici was more interested in state affairs than religion. He said, I quote, I realize that she acts more according to the reason of state than the consideration to the charity, the opposite way your majesty does. I would like to mention just one more case to show you how this term was being introduced in the practice of politics. In 1571, the Council of State of Philip II was deliberating about the creation of an armada to fight against the Turks. The conditions were really hard due to the lack of resources. The councillors in favor to the war sustained that the king couldn't waste time on this matter to avoid the discovery of his weakness and necessities, saying that, I quote, in the wisdom of state, the great princess shouldn't be shown. What they are trying to say is Philip II shouldn't display any sign of weakness. So, doing so, he was showing some principles of reason of state. And at this point, the debate on the Council of State is very interesting because the other side, the councillors that were not interested in supporting the war, they were very cautious about taking enterprise with the Pope. I'm talking about Lepanto, the Battle of Lepanto. The Philip II joined the Pope's army to defeat the Turks. So the councillors that were not very interested in taking part in this undertaking, they say that it was very problematic to mix in an enterprise with the Pope the interests of states. For them, something was not okay. So this example shows us that the languages of recent states were being discussed and shaped firstly by the practice of politics. So I'm saying about 1561, 1571. And Botero first wrote his De la Raison de Statu. I published the book in 1589. So see my point here. When the La Raison de Statu came out, it was the first time that the expression was theorized, although it carried few ambiguities. In the dedicatory letter, Botero told the Archbishop of Salzburg that he decided to write his book after traveling to so many princes' courts. There, he heard many conversations about Machiavelli, Tacitus, and after looking up for their names, he was shocked by their esteem. Machiavelli had based the wisdom of the state on little conscience, and Tacitus disguised the tyranny of Tiberius with a barbarian majestic law. Despite Botero's allegations, he followed very closely the topics of Machiavelli's prince, and as Quentin Skinner once highlighted. At this point, there is more consensus in the historiography. Botero tried to neutralize Machiavelli's arguments while moving the debate to the economic field. Romain Desandre, French historian, for example, called Botero as one of the first mercantilist thinkers. Even though wisdom of state was stamped in the book's title, it may be striking that Botero did employ the expression more than 3 or 4 times in more than 200 pages. It seems like that he was willing to draw the attention by using the expression, the title, though he was not fully committed to take the political debate to the next level. For Michel Senellart, the originality of Botero stems from his mercantilist ideas, not from the political theory. Botero displays the battlefield from politics, where it came from, to economic field. Well, when Botero published the first version of the La Raison de Statu, he was criticized because he didn't offer a definition of the term state. Only in the edition of 1596, he presented a definition of state as a firm ruler over people. Then he emphasized that wisdom of state, and I quote, wisdom of state presupposes the prince and the state, the former as artificial, the latter as material, which are not presupposed at all by foundation and in part by expansion, where they are proceeded. That was, as Victoria Khan stated, deeply rhetorical. She said, I quote, in this definition, wisdom of state is like rhetoric in that it involves deliberation about the means appropriate to realization of one's ends in particular circumstances. It also includes rhetoric in the sense that among those means are imitation and techniques of persuasion, the resources of the actor and orator. End of quote. Botero didn't go further than that, and he spent the rest of the book describing the types, the institutions, forces, and the forces of the state. He probably suffered a lot of criticism as he published in 1598 an addition to the Wisdom of State to complement his argument. In this appendix, he focused on the theme of the reputation of the prince, one of the most important topics of the language in the language of the Wisdom of State. As Victoria Khan reflected, the addition sustained that there was one truly effective wisdom of state, as Botero argued that he could make a powerful and better use of the wisdom of state or wisdom of interest of a state. The discussion about the features of the reputation was linked to that one of political obligation. We will turn back to this point later in this presentation. The concept proposed by the Piemontese writer can be taken as a common starting point to all the language of reason state. That means that the knowledge of the means that guarantee the maintenance of a state. The disputes were precisely over the classification of the best means. From this core, the political thinkers in the end of 16th century developed and extended their new ideas. Once we identify the central problem, the main question, I insist, concerns with which means were more appropriate to the maintenance and growth of a state. By this process, the language of the reason of a state acquires its plasticity. That's why I prefer to say language or sub-language as preferred John Pocock. Pedro de Ribadeneira, for example, I put the name of the book here so you can follow the presentation. Pedro de Ribadeneira, for example, divided the reason of state in the good and bad one, the true and the false, in his treatise on Christian praise. The good was the Catholic reason of state, since the means to sustain a state keep inside the borders of Christian morality. The bad one was, of course, the political and Machiavellian reason of state, which was not restrained in the imagination of Ribadeneira, was now restrained by the conscience. The enemies of this Catholic reason of state were Machiavelli, Tacitus, and also Jean Baudin, especially because Baudin attempted somehow to propose a pacification of France that could support more than one confession. So to Pedro de Ribadeneira, it was a very disturbing idea to thinking that the possibility of conciliation of more than one and true faith. The historiography took the Ribadeneira's classification too far. When we study the ideas and practice of politics, we realize that people were thinking beyond that. And sometimes they change their opinion towards a positive view of politics. At the first, it was the case, for example, I really like to mention this, Antonio de Herrera y Tordesillas. And he was a historian of Philip II, and it's very interesting how he changed his mind about this bad reason of state to good reason of state. He translated, pray that my test was, oh my God. The PDF went crazy for 1 second, but I came back. I was talking about Antonio de Herrera y Tordesillas. He translated the Declaración de Estado of Botero to Spanish and transformed the dedicatory letter into an advice to the readers, where he condemned Machiavelli and Tacitus. Years later, Tordesillas translated Tacitus to Spanish and also wrote an essay about reason of state. Marvelous. Another quick example is the case of ambassador of Catholic King Juan Bautista de Tarsis. someday I really like to talk about Tatis. But now I will just say something very curious about him. He was ambassador in France 3 times. The first time in the moment that Philip II was fighting with Catherine of Medici for the control of Portugal. Second time in 1593, when Philip II sent an embassy to France to States General to try to elect the Infanta, the Princess of Spain, as Queen of France. The third time he was ambassador in France was in the beginning of Henry IV government. It's very interesting because he just took the period that Philip II increased his intervention in France, so he fought against Henry IV till the last minute. And then this ambassador, come back to France to be an ambassador of Henry IV. For me, is the symbol of this craziness that we call reason of state in 16th, 17th century. In his first embassy in France, at the beginning of 1581, he seemed to think that reason of state was a negative phenomenon. He enlisted the evil strategies employed by Catherine of Medici as vices based on ambition, envy, or interest that usually exist in princely courts. The vices could be derived by two principles: the rules of state, properly in the world of politics, or particularities, rivalry, or simple avarice. 4 years later, his correspondence shows that he started to employ the neutral terms as matter of state, prudence's law, reason of state. But at this point, he was describing the political negotiations between France and Spain after the Duke of Anjou took Cambrai. Politics was assessment, calculation, deliberation. For me, Tassin is from this practice of politics point of view, the synthesis of this, how the reason of state get into the practice, how people were thinking, how people were practicing, how people were interpreting these theories that were circulating in Europe. And unfortunately, I can talk a little more about him, so you can ask me later. The methodological preference to use the language of reason of state has to do with the nuances and overlaps that we identify instead of the current theory of reason of state. Languages, as stated by John Pocock, provides us more flexibility to identify those variations that occurred through the 16th, 17th centuries. Although the languages preserved a basic concept of reason of state, that one of Giovanni Lutero, they show variations regarding the means to put it in practice. We also prefer languages in plural because the sources reveal that reason of state have a plentiful senses, negative, neutrals, and or positives. Now, we can stress that we are dealing with 3 major languages. At this point, I would like to say that this is only my opinion, my humble opinion, and in talking about specifically the Spanish monarchy territories in France that I'm more familiar to sustain this argument. 3 major languages. The first one, the Catholic reason of state. Think about Pedro da Rivadeneira. The second one, pragmatical vision of state, I like to think about Juan Bautista Lefrancis, this ambassador. And the third, the juridical vision of state. In the Spanish monarchy territories, the core of the disputes was marked by morals. The Catholic vision of state struggled with the pragmatic one, especially when voices started to emerge to claim for the peace with the rebels on the north and the peace with Henry of Bourbon in France. We can find many examples of this. I don't have time to dwell on this matter, but I would like to highlight that this debate was extremely relevant. In the court of Brussels, two groups emerged from the struggle, as appointed by Bernardo Garcia Garcia. One, reputationist, the other, pacifist. Only to say quickly, these two groups were fighting to influence the king to change his actions and his relations with the subjects on the north. So the reputations, they were trying to sustain the war, to keep the war, especially saying that in matter of conscience, they need to fight against the Protestants and stop the war, finish the war, will bring the loss of reputation. The other side, they were saying that reputation was not, lost some reputation to make the peace was not a big deal because the Spanish treasury was diminishing. So that's the contest, these two groups inside the Brussels Court. The last language I like to mention is the juridical wisdom of state. That was dominant in France, especially in France, it's a feature of the French political thought at this time. As we can see, the debates in this country were focusing on the juridical matters, especially the legal limitations of the royal power and its justification to subvert the laws to save the state. Conversely, they were not interested in the discussion about Christian morality, not that interested about the discussion of Christian morality. The laws of religion were partly responsible for their bias, as French were facing the real possibility of destruction of the state. The other thing I would like to say is that I make this classification according to my sources and the spacers I study, but I will not say that they are the only ones. We may find another competition, another discourse that compete with the others, but in these spaces, I could identify these three major languages. And also say that they can sometimes mix to another. They pick some time from one and blend it with another one. So I'm just identifying these three majors to make it easy for us to follow the text. I will now discuss some questions raised by the historiography concerning the reason of states. It's a challenge to study a term that had such a long existence. Since the term rose in popularity on the political vocabulary, its conceptualization has been discussed more or less frequently due to the overlapping with Machiavellism. The reason of state was also identified as a principle of the nation states, a great impulse to conquer its maximum power to survive. The classical work of Friedrich Meinecke The idea of reason of state in modern history from 1924 contributed to consolidate the conceptual equivalence of reason of state to Machiavellism. That blending was so strong that the title of the book in the first English edition was translated as Machiavelli's The Doctrine of Reason, the Doctrine of Raison d'État in French, and its place in modern history. Let's see this, what they did. The conception that reason of state was attached to the premises of rationalism and nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries was refuted by Bartolomé Claveiro. The legal historian criticized the misrepresentation of the historical and linguistical dimensions of the reason of state through a teleological projection of national states. According to Claveiro, the literature of reason of state was concerned about specific interests and didn't intend to create a science that could cover and rule all the political life. The literature originated from a way of thinking and provoked reflection that weren't the ones of theology and jurisprudence. The reason of state, I quote, didn't reveal and discover realities. It produced and habilitated thoughts. Claveiro sustained the practical dimension of the vocabulary included its ambiguity and fragile definition. However, in fact, among one meaning or another, strong or weak, there came the linguistical turning point, the syntagma reason of state. I just point out Bartolomé Claveiro because I really like his reflection about the reason of state, although the book is very difficult. I think I read it 3 times, but I think I didn't understand everything. I probably need to read again, but it's a very interesting discussion. I really like to show you because probably is not known for the major historians of early modern history. I put the book so you can compare. I will talk about 2 more historians that discussed our subject. They are Michel Senellart and Maurizio Virolli. And I will quote Maurizio Virolli is very funny historian, and he say always in his presentation that he doesn't speak English, so he will say something like, well, I speak something like English, so if he can do that, I can do that too. So I'm so sorry for this vocabulary, but let's keep. So Michel Senellart and Maurizio Virolli, there are 2 works that provided a historical approach to the reason of state, both of this historian. However, once they prioritize, my God, I shouldn't have elected this word. It's so difficult to pronounce. Prioritize. Once they prioritized distinct landmarks, they offered 2 theories about the medieval origins of reason state. Virolli said that the language of the art of state that in the future will become reason of state wasn't originated in the principles of the Roman law as ratio necessitatis or ratio status, recovered and discussed by medieval jurists. They appropriated the juridical argument to justify the enhancement of the royal power that, however, its framework for Virolli was still limited by the terms of divine law and natural law. It means that it was still inside the legal sphere. So if the king violates, if the king breaks the positive law, he's still inside the framework of divine and natural law. So for him, it's still legal sphere. Nevertheless, what Virolli called art of state has to do with a particular kind of regime whose foundation was based on violence and not the maintenance of the common good. The consequence was that in this political regime, the law and the wisdom was not a contributing factor. It was a kind of political regime, historical determinant, that emerged in Tuscany in the late Middle Age. So Virolli was looking at Tuscany, was looking at this place to state that the language of art of state was born through the political disputes inside the government of Italian city-states. To Michel Senellart, the role of jurisprudence was decisive. The theoretical sovereign from 13th century onwards will open in space, I quote, inside the doctrine of Rex Justus, an exceptional space where will arise the idea of mission state. That happening because they sustain increasingly the opposition between public interests and the law, justified by a superior necessity. The author also took a wide chronological perspective, detailing from medieval ratio status, passing through Machiavellian turbulence, and to get to the reason of state of Giovanni Botero. About this point, well, I'd like to say that we need to recognize that those ideas were being circulating and discussed at the time. We just can't fix the origin in one specific place. One thing we might say about Senellart is that since he was looking only to England and France, his visions were more limited. He defined, for example, reason of state as a capacity of the state to pass the law to assure the survival of the state. He talked a lot about jurisprudence, but almost nothing about justice, almost nothing about morality. So at this point, I would just like to say that I really appreciate the contribution of Senellart. But at this point, I identified a limitation of his interpretation, especially because his definition only serves to France. We can say that reason of state at this definition is can be applied to Spain, can be applied to Italy. So, that's my critique at this point. Over Machiavelli's role in this process, finally, we get Machiavelli, there is more harmony. Senellart questioned the relationship between Machiavelli's and reason of state. It's not possible to embed the later into the first one. It's much more complex than that. Senellart stated that we can't forget that conceptualization of the reason of state was due to ancient Senellart stated that we can't forget that the conceptualization of the reason of state was due to an anti-Machiavellian admiration. As Virolli, Senellart recognizes that Machiavelli was a fundamental piece in this process, but we can't mix one with another. I agree with them. I think that it's very Isvisky say that wisdom of state and Machiavelli is the same thing. And also, I prefer, I didn't like the expression Machiavelli. I didn't use, I don't use. And I just say that Machiavelli was a fundamental piece in this process because the construction of his idea of politics and the topics he was being constructed along the prince are the same topics that almost all the literature of wisdom of state follow. That's very important. Botero, as I said, follow the same topics. Very dangerous follow because it could bring him some problem. And one example, just one, because I will trespass my time. But one example is the point about religion. For Machiavelli, keep one religion was very important just to keep unite one state. So for Botero, he said it's true. The religion is utility, has a utility, I forget the word, but we can say the religion was very necessary in a city, and Botero said that. And in this discussion, Botero was not necessarily talking about the truth of Catholic religion. He was saying that the religion, the ancient ones, the present ones, were important to sustain and to keep a people united. So that's one point that I would like to say, how Machiavelli is important to these topics that will keep moving the debate of wisdom state. Now I will lead to the conclusions after the study of practices of power. So now I present this theoretical debate, this a little harsh debate. So I want to present you now my reflections after study for a long time. I think the documents of the practice of politics, especially the diplomatic ones, administrative ones, and also memorials, kind of papers that were not the normative one. I say that I used to read the backstage of the history of ideas. So now I will lead this to the conclusions after the study of the practice of politics. We can't underestimate the impact of the circulation and the reading of the ideas in early modern Europe. We need to think beyond one place, one territory. We also can't forget that the recuperation of the ancient manuscripts made available to those men the works of historians like Tacitus, Sallust, and Livy, and the political ideas and concepts of the ancient history fit with the men eager to learn lessons from the past. In the end of 16th century, the furor that followed with the first translations of Tacitus' works had more to do with the perception of the similarities of historical terms. The rise to fame of Tacitus was due to the comparative vision of the period of the first Roman emperors and the Europe at the beginning of 17th century. There were similar political challenges, and they were particularly interested in the lessons they could learn from the ancient. That's why At this point, I disagree with a persisting statement that claims the importance of Tacitus was due to the possibility of talking secretly about Machiavelli without naming him. This is a very polemical point. So I just like to say I disagree, because talking about Machiavelli without naming him was easy. But Botero did that. Botero followed the same topic, the same polemics. The problem was, what are you saying about what Machiavelli said? The problem was not precisely naming Machiavelli. And in the end of 16th, in beginning 17th century, Machiavelli was much more an imagination to the Catholic vision of faith than a real Machiavelli. So we need to separate something. So I disagree with this point of view that Tacitus was important, because people could use it to say about Machiavelli without knowing Machiavelli. Tacitus was very important because of this. People were thinking that, people especially, I'm thinking this group of people I study, and there was similarity of times in the time of Tiberius and the difficulties of Europe in the end of 16th century. There was the financial problems. There was a feeling that something was not that good, especially in Spanish monarchy after the defeat of the Joyous Army. No? That's my point. I will not say a lot more about this. We can turn back later. I would like to state that the debate on the interest of states weren't a monopoly of early modern period. Since the antiquity, philosophers and historians discussed of the subject. Thucydides, for example, reproduced a speech of an ambassador from Athens about why they extended the empire. First, they say, the circumstances led the city to expand by fear. After that, they were impelled by honor, and finally by their interest. It's no worry that they speak about the interests of the state without embarrassment. The rise of the languages or reason of state in early modern history was strongly connected to the Reformations. That's the particularity of it, and sometimes that element is forgotten. Then we assume that the talk about the interest and goal of a state acquired new meanings after the split of the Christendom's unity. There was the necessity to reiterate the dependence of the politics to Christian morality. That's why the languages of reason of state, especially the pragmatical and juridical ones, were polemical. But let's not be naive. Despite of that, the troops of Emperor Charles V pillaged the holy city of Rome. This shows that the relations of politics and religion were never simple. So I'm saying that the relationship between religion and politics was never simple. When we think about Charles the Emperor, Charles V, or the King of Spain, Charles I, we always think with this king that fought to support the Christian, the Catholic Roman Church. But when we are talking about politics, Charles V invaded. Charles V, his army destroyed the city of Rome in a fight against the Pope. So let's not be naive to say that no, the Catholic king will never think about politics. They will never search his interest, because that it's very polemical. That's what I'm trying to say. Other aspect that I would like to mention concerns the neo-stoicism. It's not necessary to repeat the role of the 6 books of politics in the consolidation of the languages of reason of state. But our studies show that in Spanish monarchy territories, the neo-stoicism had a double impact. For the one hand, the language of pragmatical reason of state incorporated the political agenda of the neo-stoicism, in particular, the defense of peace and the reconciliation with the prince and the subject by the idea of political obligation. On the other hand, we found out that the defenders of Catholic reason of state, as well as the French school, were willing to adopt the moral principles of neo-stoicism, especially the concept of constancy. And here I mentioned Pedro de Ribadeneira that tried to adapt the constancy of Justus Lipsius to a Catholic version of its philosophy. Veronica, I have more 3 minutes. Okay, so that's a good part, I promise. It's the best part. I will finish my essay telling you about an event that, in my viewpoint, denotes the moment that the language of reason of state acquired a new status in Spanish monarchy. While we used to say that Botero consolidates the main lines of the theory, I think that Justus Lipsius consolidates in practice. That event happened on November 26, in 1599. In that day, the philosopher Justus Lipsius had an amazing afternoon in Brussels. He was invited by the Archduke Albert of Austria to present a conference to the new sovereigns of Spanish Low Countries. The new sovereigns were Albert of Austria and Isabella, the Spanish princess that Philip II once intended to be the Queen of France. The lesson was a part of the festivities that celebrated the joyous entry of the archdukes in Louvain. The meeting was exceptional due to its symbolism. The new governors seemed to reach out to the north's subjects. And Lipsius got the message and took advantage of the situation. He decided to talk about the topic of political obedience, using Seneca's De Clementia as a source. The choice of the epidictic genre allowed Lipsius to mobilize a set of precepts capable to lead the audience to penetrate the rhetorical dichotomy of light and darkness. The triad, darkness, storm, war, were constructed by the opposition to light, sun, and peace. War and peace, old and new, between the anguish and the hope. Lipsius dwelled on this part of the Clementia to extract the arguments to sustain the reconciliation between the sovereignty and the subjects. Clemency was the bridge among them, the base to restore the bond of love that featured the relation between kings and subjects. Lipsius claimed to Albert and Isabella. I quote, "I, your Serene Highness, by the public voice of Belgium, and by both feelings, offer you the benevolence and fidelity, while, without any presumption, add throughout these remarkable features on us, or insignia of an old time, courage and faith." it had a bit longer than a year. It had been a bit longer than a year that Philip II of Spain had died. The prudent king conceded the sovereignty of Spanish Low Countries to his daughter, Isabella, and the Archduke Albert. The concession should be formalized by the wedding between the royal princesses. After all, what's going to happen then? After 40 years of wars of religion, the Low Countries were devastated, and the Spanish king's treasury decreased. The terrifying army of Flanders were reducing and retaining. The Dutch have been insisting to reach an agreement that included the matter of conscience, and Philip II always replied that he will never be the king of heretics. So, what about Justus Lipsius? He was, if we can say so, the synthesis of those outcries. The philosopher was relaxed and forgiving when he decided to come back to Catholic Church and reconcile with his natural king. In 1595, he obtained the position of royal chronicler, although he never practiced it. Since then, Lipsius was a voice to the peace agreement between the rebels and the Spain. I will not go further on this matter. However, we just want to bring to attention that this lesson and Justus Lipsius' claim represent a major turning point, not only because it was undertaken by this philosopher, but because it happened openly in a public space and addressed the war standing up for peace agreement. We can take the risk to say that something changed. Since then, reason of state in public space was not a taboo anymore. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Too much, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Professor Marcella, for such an interesting talk. It was truly fascinating. As we had mentioned earlier, today the questions are to be made exclusively on the chat, please, either in English, in Spanish, or in Portuguese. For the sake of the audience, I'll still read those out loud for everyone to hear, but we kindly ask you to type all the messages, all the questions and comments in the chat. Is anyone wants to go first?
Well, I didn't so any question?
Well, Verônica has posed a question in the chat. Marcella, could you talk a little bit more about the imaginary, Machiavelli?
Yes, it's very interesting that one author once said that the point was the people took so many weapons against Machiavelli that made him much more famous than supposed to be. So fighting so hard against him made him very famous, very evil, and in practice, they constructed an idea of Machiavelli and that didn't correspond on what Machiavelli actually wrote. So that's my point. The debate of Catholic vision of state was trying to demonize, was trying to put words in Machiavelli's mouth. They were trying to find an enemy, and from this moment, they can sustain his own vision of politics. So that's this imaginary Machiavelli, a Machiavelli that never considered the morality of Machiavelli, that was, after all, an enemy of religion, because Machiavelli he was not easy because he said something about the religion, the idea that the religion, anyone who served to keep a population united, was very polemical, because the only true religion, the only possible religion, was the Catholic religion. So that, for example, was very problematical. But in the end of 16th century, trying the rumors, the speaking, the idea of this evil Machiavelli was so much more than about what he actually said. Pablo Fernández Albaladejo, a Spanish historian, used to say used to say something about this, because he studied the Catholic reason of state, and he always say that what people are thinking about this Machiavelli is something imaginary, and something that was not what he actually said. I think about it.
Great, thank you, Marcella. Do you have any other questions? Pedro. Ótima fala, Marcela. Queria perguntar se em seus estudos sobre razão de Estado você acabou esbarrando com o direito das gentes, no sentido de que gostaria de entender o quanto a discussão da preservação dos Estados, razão de Estado, está presente nas relações jurídicas internacionais, o direito das gentes. Você acabou vendo algo sobre o direito das gentes? Obrigado pela fala, gostei muito.
Obrigada, Pedro. Thank you for your question. Actually, Giovanni Botero talked a little about this theme, and he was very interested to define the features of a population, and then the international relations that could guide the relationship between the states. So actually, Giovanni Botero talked a little about that, but the discussion of my sources are very preliminary, are very basic. They didn't get to the point to formulate a theory or formulate something more like it. But I like to I take this opportunity to say about a very curious case about an English Jesuit named Joseph Creswell, that he wrote many memorials to the King Philip II to convince the king to invade England. And one of these memorials, in 1596, he was saying about how reason of state could be used as an international guidance, as an international principle to guide the relation of the state. And Joseph Creswell has a very, very interesting vision. For him, the reason of state can be understood by, we can say, balance of power. It's a very known term, but I like to say it's a balance of power, because he say that any moment that one state can be amenazed or can try to conquer another state, they are practicing something like an evil interest. But after the moment the reason of state can be said that this balance of power, this equilibrium, this equilibrium in English is the same. Yeah. This equilibrium of states. That's why Creswell say that in the name of reason of state, Philip II should invade England. So it's a very crazy formulation. Six reasons of state of why Philip II should invade England. And one of them was sustaining this balance of power. So, and the juridical discussion was not what's not common in Spain, especially because of the presence of scholastic. In Spain, they were not thinking a lot about the breaking the law. The discussion is not a little about that. Of course, breaking law is something serious. I'm not saying it's not. But breaking law is not is not big deal. Saint Thomas of Aquinas, Verônica, help me because I don't know. Saint Thomas of Aquinas, how is it in English? Santo Tomás de Aquino.
I guess it's Tomás Aquino.
Thomas
Aquinas, yeah. It's very similar because it's Latin.
Aquinas.
So it's very similar.
Pedro. He said on that book about the Prince of Chipre that breaking the positive law was not something very damaging. He means if a king breaks the positive law, he needs to have the power to change it. So it's not something very problematical. Of course, the problem is to break the natural divine law. But Aquinas recommended that the king should follow the law. But the discussion about the limitations of a king by the positive law was not a big deal in this moment in my source. They're not talking a lot about that. But they are talking about the necessity of coordinate to elaborate the international relations about the princes. And reason of state is a lot about that. So I don't know if I answered your questions. Another one. Can I read, Lívia?
Yes, I would just apologize that I was going to translate Pedro's questions and I forgot. I'm sorry. Basically, Pedro's question that Marcella just answered was about the relations between the reason of state and people's rights and how that appeared during her research. My apologies for that. So Verônica in the sequence had asked if you could mention something about the Protestant reception of those ideas and languages of the reason of state.
Yes, actually, it's very interesting because these Jesuits, I told you I studied English Jesuits. They say that in England, especially the Anglicans, they were very close to the reason of state because they were not passionate about religion. They were something like moderate. So another Jesuit I studied. I'm just mentioning the sources that are very interesting. Then I'm talking about the Protestants. Um, Another Jesuit, Father Robert Persons. I don't know if you know about him because it was very polemical, but he wrote a memorial to Philip II and then Philip III because it was just in the moment of the changing of government. But he wrote a memorial to guide the King of Spain about the knowledge of whose people are in the Council of State of England. And it's very interesting because he was just describing how the Protestants are very, we can say, they were practicing this vision of state in a way that it was very natural for them because they were not passionate about religion and about imposed religion matters. And I think that in this reception, Protestant was less embarrassing. The Protestants was not embarrassing about this debate of the morality and the politics. They are more they were more comfortable to talk about the reason of state. And at this point, Senellart, for example, studied a little the German theoreticals of reason state. And at this point, this is something interesting. They were not that worried about this morality and this consequence to the conscience, and especially were more interested about this world of politics and what they can learn about it. That's what a little that I know about the Protestant side of this idea.
Thank you, Marcella. Now we have a question from Alexandre. Do you consider that there is a separation between the prince and the people, be it the nobles or the people, based on the concept of reason of state? Because in France until the mid-17th century, it is impossible to conceive the separation from the analysis of the political context. But thinking about the separation helps us to think not only about political terms, but also the idea of public space, that you used at the end of your presentation, and that is so important to me.
Mm-hmm. I can't say. I don't think so. There is a separation, but I think that in this time, the concept at this point I follow Quentin Skinner. In this point, the concept of state, not vision state, the concept of state as a locus of power that is different from the government, from the people, and this locus of power is permanent. I can see clearly that this is happening. I can see how in the practice of politics, my sources are reflection. My source are my people were reflection. So about what is this? What is the state? What is in Spain? They used to say monarchy instead state, even state empire. When you read the expression Spanish monarchy or monarchy, they are talking about a dominion that family, a royal family, made over a territory and a population. So it's important to say, because if you read a document, it's very interesting. But I think that it's not yet that we can say there are separation. And even let's think about the people that were inside this framework of the pragmatical reason state. When they sustain the peace agreement with the subjects in the Low Countries, they are trying to restore the bonds between the king and the subjects. They are saying, Justus Lipsius, that was important, that was necessary to reconstruct the love between them, the love in the subjects to the king. At the same time, they say that the king, it's another point that's interesting, the king should recognize the differences between the subjects, because the subjects of the Low Countries are different from the subjects of Spain or Italy or America. So based on Botero and Baudin, there were a plenty of debates, discussions about the natural features of each population, where it was in the geographical scale, the humor of these people, how they were physically. So knowing about that, knowing the people, the subject, the king will be a better condition to approach to the subject, to restore the love. And the political administration to each one of these territories should be different too, because the necessities are different. So to conclude, first, I don't see at this moment that there was a separation, and there is clearly an attempt to restore the bonds between the rebels and the king. But at the same time, in the discussions, I can visualize the construction of the state concept. It's not completely done yet, but more and more, increasingly, they start to think about, not about the kingdom, but about a state that is much more than a king and then a subject. That's my opinion. Thank you for your question. Very interesting.
Thank you, Marcella. Do we have any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Professor Marcella. That was a fascinating topic, and we had some really fascinating questions today as well. Thank you very much for everyone that engaged. Before we leave, I'd like to ask you all to come to our next meeting, which is going to be on the 19th of October. And we'll have the pleasure to receive Professor Luciana Villas-Boas, who's going to be talking about early modern utopia. And it's also promising to be a very fascinating paper. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Marcella. Hope you have a good evening.
Thank you for the invitation.